Alright, so I just finished my workout, and I figured I'd do a quick point-by-point response to Ryu and Rect from IRC. Actually, I guess it's more of a response to the litany of garbage Ryu was spewing earlier, because Rect didn't really say anything substantive. But anyway, I'll try to make this video as short as possible, but to those of you watching, if this ends up dragging on for too long, just set the playback speed to 2 times so you can finish it in half the time. Or just don't watch it, I don't really care. Alright, so let's scroll up here and go through all of Ryu's shit, point by point. I don't expect him to actually listen to all this, but that's fine. I don't think he has the intellectual curiosity or the open-mindedness to consider an opposing point of view, or that he might be wrong. That's okay, this isn't just for his benefit, obviously. So let's see, he starts by saying, quote, "Everything points to Trump withholding aid in exchange for secret conditions to help himself," close quote. Secret? Trump called for the investigations on a phone call that he knew was being listened in on by a bunch of people from many different agencies, including all of the people on the other line where Zelensky was. All those people listening to the call. This is obviously not how you would set up a secret, nefarious plot. That's the kind of thing you'd do either in person, in a one-on-one conversation, or something you'd privately tell to a trusted confidant like Rudy or Pompeo, so that then they can secretly relay it to Zelensky somehow. Just basic common sense. And now he posts a bunch of laughable non sequiturs that he seems to think are a logical basis for concluding that Trump was withholding aid just to help himself win the 2020 election. Quote, "The Defense Department just wrote a letter to Congress arguing Ukraine had done enough to combat corruption to justify sending them aid," close quote. Oh boy. The Defense Department only signed off on whether they believed Ukraine was doing enough to combat corruption as it relates to the defense-related aid that they were being given. Not whether Ukraine is doing enough to combat corruption across the whole government. I mean, do you seriously think that the Defense Department investigated everything that I meticulously laid out in my last video, like everything from the political article that talked about Ukrainian effort to sabotage Trump and the potential corruption involving Joe and Hunter Biden? Or even all the things that Rudy was digging up and feeding to Trump? No. Obviously, the Defense Department did not look into all that. One, that's not really their job or their mandate. And two, they wouldn't even be able to properly do that without the cooperation of Ukrainian officials. That's more of a job for the Department of Justice and the FBI. And remember, the Defense Department is part of the executive branch, which is headed up by the president. The Defense Department gives their recommendation, but the president always retains the authority to reject it for his own reasons. Reasons that they might not have even considered. The Defense Department is not the final word on this. Congress and the president can overrule in their own respective ways. The president does have to eventually release the funds that have been appropriated by Congress, but that's irrelevant because your whole point here is presumably to suggest that because the Defense Department signed off on this, therefore, Trump couldn't possibly believe there was a legitimate basis to withhold the aid out of concern for corruption. But yes, he most certainly could have, because he was also interested in an entirely different kind of corruption, the kind that has domestic ramifications here at home, in our own election, and with our own high-level government officials. Remember what Sondland said? Trump told him this, quote, "They're all corrupt, they're all terrible people. I don't want to spend any time with that. They tried to take me down," close quote. So you see, he explicitly said that he thinks they're corrupt. He said this before the whistleblower complaint, so it's not something he just invented as an excuse after the fact. And the reason he feels that way is because of everything I explained in my last video. And also because of all the negative information that Rudy was feeding him, obviously. And then he go on to say, quote, when Trump was asked if he ever asked a foreign leader to start an investigation into someone who was not a political rival, he couldn't name a single case, close quote. This is completely irrelevant because Trump's rather unique call for an investigation into a political rival was prompted by a uniquely concerning situation. Can you name another high-profile politician who has publicly admitted to doing something as overtly shady as what Joe Biden did, given the circumstances surrounding his son? Have you ever heard of a vice president of the United States personally intervening to have the prosecutor general of a foreign country fired? A prosecutor that happened to be investigating a known corrupt company where his poorly qualified son was working as a director and getting paid millions of dollars? Can you think of another government official who the majority of Americans think should be investigated for corruption, as national polls indicate when it comes to Joe and Hunter Biden? No. I mean, shit. A lot of the investigations Democrats have done with Trump are pretty unique too, including some of the things Mueller and his gang of activist Democrat lawyers did with his associates. So do you also believe that those were corruptly partisan abuses of power? Just because it's a first doesn't mean it's illegitimate. You have to focus on the merits of the investigation. And in this case, we have to focus on the merits with respect to what Trump openly believed. Because in an impeachment inquiry, we have to consider his motives and whether he had actual corrupt intent, not merely whether he was mistaken. I mean, obviously, if you're a liberal partisan hack, you're going to profess that Biden is clean as a whistle and that no investigation into him is legitimately warranted. But that's irrelevant. Only the evidence of Trump's state of mind matters here. Quote, Trump didn't discuss corruption in general on the phone call, close quote. Corruption in general. I'm not sure what you mean by that or why you think that's relevant, but the things that Trump was alluding to on the call did involve potential corruption, including domestic corruption, the worst kind in the view of any responsible president. I mean, obviously, when Trump was talking about CrowdStrike and wealthy people and the seemingly horrible things that Biden might have done and the, quote, lots of things that went on, he's referring to things that he considers to be bad acts. That's corruption he's talking about. I mean, if by general corruption you mean the general corruption in Ukraine, then no, that was probably of relatively little importance to Trump, which seems perfectly normal and understandable, especially given that he's all about America first. No, what matters to him is rooting out corruption that affects us here at home, like the kind of corruption that might influence or interfere with our national elections, like the kind of corruption that may involve our own government officials at the highest levels. All of that obviously is a significantly greater national security concern than rooting out just general corruption in foreign countries. And remember, this is a memo based on people's rough recollections of the call. It's not an exact transcript that we can say reliably captured absolutely everything. Trump was simply racking off some of his concerns off the top of his head. It wasn't a comprehensive list of things that concerned him, obviously. That's why he suggested that Zelensky talk to Rudy to get all the details. But yes, he was mostly concerned about domestic corruption, not, corruption in general in Ukraine. And so what? Do you see Democrats investigating fellow Democrats or corruption in general? No, they're exclusively focused on finding acts of corruption by Trump and his associates. So what do you think? Should we impeach all the Democrats for corruption and abuse of power? Quote, he was only holding the aid until Zelensky announced the investigations on CNN, close quote. All right, I'm not exactly sure what your point here is, but I suspect you're driving at the same crap you said the other day, that Trump only wanted them to announce the investigations, not to actually investigate. I explained in my last video why that makes no sense. Assuming Trump actually did that doesn't mean that he didn't want the investigation to be conducted. So at the 29-minute mark of my last video, I went ahead and explained why it is that it was perfectly reasonable for Trump to request a public announcement of the investigations. So I'm not going to repeat that here. You can just go listen to it. But I did want to go into this ridiculous conspiracy theory again, that he did not want the investigations to ever be conducted. He just wanted the announcements. So I see three possibilities here with regard to that, and none of them make sense. So possibility number one would be, okay, so Trump expects the investigation to find something improper. Well, if that's the case, then it would make no sense for him to not want the investigations to be conducted. Possibility number two, Trump expects that the investigations would not find anything improper, and that they'd instead, effectively absolve Ukraine and the Bidens of any wrongdoing. Well, that's ridiculous because we already have plenty of evidence that Ukraine tried to undermine Trump's candidacy in 2016, as I explained in my last video. And as far as the Bidens are concerned, well, as polls have shown, the majority of Americans believe that the Bidens should be investigated for corruption because they obviously think everything in that situation looks dirty. And we know Trump is more cynical, conspiratorial, and paranoid than your average person. So the idea that Trump would actually expect the investigation to absolve Ukraine and the Bidens is just absurd. And then there's possibility number three, that Trump doesn't really know what to expect from the investigations, and who knows, they might effectively absolve the Bidens. So he figures it's politically safer to just announce the investigations to inflict some political damage on them without, risking a total absolution of wrongdoing by actually conducting the investigation. Well, the problem with that theory is that he would have to explicitly relay that to Zelensky, that he should only announce and never investigate. How else is Zelensky supposed to assume that he should never actually conduct the investigation that Trump was demanding him to announce? And obviously we have zero evidence that anything like that was explicitly stipulated anywhere. So you see, no matter how we slice it, this idiotic conspiracy theory falls apart. It's completely baseless. Quote, when Trump learned of the whistleblower complaint, he released the aid shortly afterwards. Close quote. All right, so this is a cynical assumption that Trump released the aid because of the whistleblower complaint. If he really felt that he'd been caught doing something nefarious, then one would think that he would have released the aid immediately, like the same day or the next day. But instead, he released it 2 weeks later, while many things were happening. Like the frantic pleading by his diplomats and ambassadors that he release the aid and have a meeting with Zelensky. Like the people at OMB trying to determine how long he's legally allowed to withhold the aid. And like the last minute intervention by the GOP, when Republicans like Lindsey Graham, came in and urged him to release the aid. 2 days later, that's when Trump actually released the aid. So there were a lot of things that were happening there. All right, what else? Let's see here. All right, so you claim that you debunked the GOP memo, or at least part of it. You said that you debunked page 2, second paragraph from the bottom. And you claim you did that by posting an article that shows that European countries have contributed about as much to Ukraine as the US. Well, let's read that paragraph and analyze if that fact you referenced actually debunks it. But before I get into that, let's just be clear here. It is a fact that the United States assumes a lion's share of the financial responsibility when it comes to military aid. If Trump has conflated that fact with the idea that other countries barely contribute at all for anything, well, then he'd be mistaken on that specific claim. But that doesn't invalidate all of his concerns here. Why is it that European countries are contributing so little financially for military aid? Well, from what I understand, it's because they're afraid to be seen as engaging in a proxy war against Russia. So from Trump's highly pragmatic, America first standpoint, it seems perfectly reasonable for him to wonder why it's incumbent on us to shoulder the bulk of this financial burden while hurting our own relationship with Russia, economically, politically, etc. While the European countries that have a far greater vested interest in that situation don't have to lift a finger financially in that regard, and they don't have to sacrifice their relationship with Russia. I don't know, but seems like a perfectly sensible question to me. But whatever, let's put all that aside and get back to how you think this mistake by Trump, where he was allegedly equivocating between military financial aid and total financial aid, how in the world does that erroneous belief of Trump's debunk that paragraph you referenced in the GOP memo? Let's go through that paragraph line by line. Quote, the body of evidence shows that instead that President Trump holds a deep-seated, genuine, and reasonable skepticism of Ukraine due to its history of pervasive corruption. That's true. He does hold that belief. The president has also been vocal about his skepticism of U.S. foreign aid and the need for... That's also a fact. That's true. The president has been vocal about that. Public reporting shows how senior Ukrainian officials interfered in the 2016 election in favor of Hillary Clinton and in opposition to then-candidate Trump. Also a fact. That's true as well. And then, final sentence, seen in this light, any reluctance on the president's part to meet with President Zelensky or to provide taxpayer-funded assistance to Ukraine is entirely reasonable. All right, entirely reasonable. That's a judgment call, but seems perfectly justifiable given everything else that they just explained in Trump's state of mind. So, yeah. So nothing you said debunks any of that. So that's a total debunk fail. Trump makes erroneous and hyperbolic claims all the time. We all know that he's fast and loose with his words. He's not exactly known for his accuracy and his attention to detail, but the gist of his concern here is abundantly clear, and that's all that matters. All right. Quote, impeachment was written into the Constitution to address the case where a president used his office to aid his reelection, close quote. All right, so I said I wasn't going to quibble with this in the chat, but I might as well go into it now for the purpose of completeness. First of all, everything a president does to help the country can be said to be aiding his reelection. But, nitpicks aside, the reason I called this statement of yours asinine is because it reads as though you're suggesting that the sole overarching concern when the impeachment process was first introduced is that the president might corruptly use his office to aid his reelection. But the founders were obviously concerned about a lot more than just that. They were concerned about any egregious act of corruption or abuse of power, including treason and high crimes, of course. Their point was that the president should not be above the law and that he shouldn't be free to abuse his authority for purely personal gain. So obviously, if it were adequately demonstrated that the president corruptly attempted to aid his reelection efforts, that would be potential grounds for impeachment, depending on the nature and severity of the attempt. But as I explained in my last video, that has not been established with Trump. Not even close. All right, so then you reference this Constitutional Convention link. I skimmed through that link before, and it says nothing to support your overly simplistic idea that impeachment was written into the Constitution with the express purpose or the overarching concern that a president would use his office to aid in his reelection. As I just finished explaining, their rationale for an impeachment clause was about a lot more than just election meddling. I mean, I suggest you read the Federalist Papers and see what Alexander Hamilton warned about when it came to impeachment. In a nutshell, he was concerned that it would become a partisan political affair, which is exactly what this impeachment obsession by the Democrats has become. They've been calling for his impeachment since day one. None of this shit is being handled in good faith and an honest effort to find the truth. It's a witch hunt. All right, what else? And what you're seeing, quote, and what you're seeing with Ukraine is just a tip of the iceberg. That transcript that was classified as secret level went onto a code word level server where it joined blah, blah, blah. Okay, so if you had actually read the depositions or watched and paid attention to all the testimony, you would know how this happened. But since you obviously didn't do any of that, I'll go ahead and explain it to you. This all happened because a National Security Council official named Tim Morrison was concerned about the potential leak of this memo, which was obviously a totally reasonable concern given the litany of leaks this administration's endured since its inception. And why was he concerned that the memo would leak? Was it because he thought there was something grossly inappropriate or concerning about the actual contents of the call? No. When he was asked that very question during his deposition, he said it was only because he was concerned about the distorted, hyper-partisan way that it might be publicly spun by people in Washington. He wasn't sure how Ukraine would internalize that and whether it would politicize the issue to the point that it might cost them bipartisan support. So because of that, he asked one of his underlings or whatever, some guy named John Eisenberg, I think, to make sure that the memo was secured and wouldn't leak. And then Eisenberg relayed that to his deputy, who then mistakenly decided to move the memo to that highly classified server you're talking about. No one specifically requested that, though. Morrison and Eisenberg both testified that it was an administrative error. They attested to this under oath and under penalty of perjury. So you see, there's no evidence that Trump ordered this or that it was an attempted cover-up of something anyone knew was wrong. It was simply a political calculation that, in hindsight, turned out to be unbelievably prescient, given that Morrison's concerns are exactly what has now happened since that memo was released. So those are the facts. Does any of that seem unreasonable to you? No, I don't think so. See, it actually helps to be familiar with all the testimony and relevant facts instead of just relying on hyper-partisan Twitter feeds and news outlets to spoon-feed this to you in the form of propaganda. When I get around to uploading this video tomorrow, I'll make sure to put a link to Morrison's deposition in the description box. I suggest you actually read it. And I guess that's it. So you failed to raise even a single salient point that would reasonably cause someone to objectively conclude that Trump committed an impeachable offense. That he abuses authority for purely personal gain. You provided no evidence that what he did was solely to help his 2020 re-election efforts. I mean, could that have been part of his motivation? Yeah, sure. It's possible. Just as it's entirely possible, likely even, that Democrat investigations into Trump and his associates are at least partly motivated to help themselves win the 2020 election. I don't see you calling for their impeachment. Have you ever bothered to objectively analyze your argument from a critical point of view? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that you haven't. All you're doing is gathering a bunch of cynical and largely irrelevant talking points from liberal Twitter feeds and news outlets, and then you vomit it into the channel and walk away as though you've as though you've successfully refuted something. Absolutely nothing you posted does anything to suggest that Trump's concerns were just a bullshit pretext for a knowingly corrupt act. Trump's been open about many of these concerns of his for months, years in some cases. It's not like this is the first time we're hearing about this. Now, you can go ahead and try to argue that a lot of these concerns of his were overblown or completely unwarranted, but that does nothing to reasonably suggest that he had corrupt intent or that it justifies an impeachment, especially when he's been publicly expressing these supposedly ill-founded concerns for a long time. As I said in the chat, being wrong about something is not a crime or an impeachable offense. Being overly credulous is also not a crime or an impeachable offense, and neither is being a conspiracy nut. And allowing yourself to be misguided by a trusted, overly zealous personal attorney is also not a crime or an impeachable offense. I'm not saying that's what Rudy is. I'm just saying, hypothetically, if that were the case, that's not a crime or an impeachable offense. If it's an abuse of power for Trump to call for an investigation into a political rival for something that seems potentially corrupt to the majority of Americans, as polls show, then practically every Democrat would have to be impeached for tirelessly investigating Trump and his associates in search of a crime for the past 3 years and counting. I mean, if you think Trump shouldn't call for investigations into political opponents, that is, if you think he shouldn't do what he campaigned on, which is to try to drain the swamp, and you think the president is too much of a conspiracy nut, too paranoid, too credulous, too easily deceived by dopey supporters, too quick to believe that, Democrats are acting with corrupt intent against him or that other governments are out to sabotage him. Well, if you really believe that and that's that important to you, then simply don't vote for the guy. Don't vote for him in the next election. That's not what the impeachment process is for. Otherwise, this can be easily weaponized to remove any future president for almost any reason that the congressional majority sees fit. Now, you want to know what would count as evidence of corrupt intent? I'll give you some examples. Let's say Trump had privately asked a foreign leader, or even Bill Barr. Imagine if he had asked them to investigate Pete Buttigieg, just out of the blue for no reason. That would be a clear abuse of power because there's no legitimate basis for investigating Pete Buttigieg. There isn't even an appearance of impropriety there. A case like that would be a lot more clear-cut. Still somewhat ambiguous whether it would, rise to an impeachable offense, but it would, reasonably raise the question at least and give Democrats a much stronger leg to stand on. Incidentally, this is part of the reason why the negative inferences we've seen from some of these Democrat witnesses are so utterly useless. Because when they were pressed by Republicans on some highly relevant facts regarding some of Trump's concerns, most of these ambassadors and government officials were completely oblivious. They had no idea that one of Trump's primary concerns with Ukrainian corruption was about election interference. They had no idea what his concerns about the Bidens were. So absent that information, they were left with nothing but to assume that it was purely for personal political purposes. Seems reasonable, but it's because they were ignorant of all the facts, all the things that were concerning him. If they had known everything that I laid out in my last video regarding Ukrainian interference and the shady set of circumstances surrounding Joe and Hunter Biden, and they had every negative piece of information that Rudy was presumably relaying to Trump, then I can practically guarantee you that most of those witnesses would not have immediately assumed that Trump's concerns were purely for personal gain. They would have realized that there was some legitimate domestic national security concerns. They might have still disagreed with Trump's approach to the situation, but they would have at least had more context to understand his motivations. So what else would count as good evidence that Trump abused his authority or acted with corrupt intent here? Let's say Ambassador Volker had testified that he personally told Trump that he didn't think Joe Biden did anything corrupt, that he'd known him a long time, and that he didn't think that Joe was capable of such a thing. And let's say that Volker said that when he said that to Trump, Trump replied with something like, "Oh, I know that, but hey, this is politics, and you know, it's a dirty business, wink, wink. Besides, you never know, we might find something there." If Volker had said something like that, I would believe him, and I would see that as a really good example of corrupt intent and abuse of power. But you have nothing like that here. You're interpreting all of this from a purely cynical and hyper-partisan standpoint while ignoring simpler, more mundane explanations and huge swaths of exculpatory evidence. The mere fact that Trump might personally gain in discovering corruption by Biden does not, in and of itself, make it corrupt. If that were the case, then you'd have to consider Democrats corrupt because they also have a lot to gain personally and politically if their investigations to Trump find, conclusive evidence of a crime or wrongdoing. Does that mean you think all Democrat investigations into Trump are corrupt and purely for personal gain, abuses of power? No, I imagine you think their investigations are both entirely legitimate and personally beneficial. Anyway, that's all I have to say for now. I don't know if you're going to listen to this or not, but it doesn't matter. Someone will, and they'll hopefully find this useful. But if you never actually do listen to this, it just proves how hopelessly close-minded you are. So arrogant and full of yourself that you can't even consider the possibility that you're wrong. Either that or you're just, so insecure and pathetic that you're afraid to honestly engage in an argument you might lose. I mean, you spend the majority of your days spewing BS on IRC, sometimes arguing with me for hours on end, but then you can't be bothered to watch a more comprehensive video like this one that goes into all the nuances. Please spare me.